getting all these golds, getting all these medals, or cocky Noah Lyles, the sprinter with the Pokemon cards that he puts in his thing. He gets COVID and he gets a bronze medal with COVID or something like that. The greatest basketball game I've ever watched when LeBron and Steph won the gold medal for the basketball, or everyone's favorite breakdancer, the Australian Ray Gunn. I mean, just killing it out there with the cultural interpretive dancing. These are probably the images that you think about as you go forward and you think about Paris 2024. You probably think about these sports, these people, the more I don't know, I'll call them popular athletic feats. But you know what I'm going to remember because I cared about it? I'm going to care about the golf. I mean, because that's what I watched. It was, you probably missed it. I didn't miss it. I taped it. I woke up super early to watch it. Like, it was electric. It was electric stuff out there, specifically coming down to the wire for the men's golf. And so, gold medal, it did go to an American. He's the best player in the world. His name is Scottie Scheffler. But the guy there on the right side, he's from Japan. His name is Hideki Matsuyama. He's a really good golfer. He's actually known as like the greatest Asian golfer of all time, like of all of history. Like, he is the pinnacle. He's really, really, really good. And so he's an icon in Japan. He's won the Masters before, and he's right now, I think he's the world number six in the entire world right now. So he got the bronze medal. And Hideki has had the same caddy his whole career. So a caddy, if you don't know what a caddy is, you watch golf, it's the guy that stands next to him as he's walking through. He's had the same caddy. His name is Shota Hayafuji. And Shota Hayafuji, he's been his caddy his entire career. All of the achievements, all of the tournaments that he's won, this guy has been there right at his side. And if you don't watch golf, you don't know what a caddy is. It's basically the guy that comes with the little scorecard, and he's like the data guy. He does all of the data, all of the research about the course. He kind of plots every hole and every map to exactly where you should do it. So a player depends very highly on his caddy. He's basically his assistant, his right-hand man, the guy that is going to, in a sense, like lead him, give him the right information to victory. And so he's had the same guy on his bag, and he won the bronze medal in Paris with this caddy, Shota. And so anyway, after the Olympics, it was back to the United States for a tournament in Memphis, Tennessee. So to Paris to Memphis, Tennessee was the transition. And so he went through London. Him and his caddy and his coach went through London. And so they're stopped one night in London, and they're out at dinner, and all of their bags get stolen at dinner. So he's at dinner. All of their bags get stolen during this dinner. Included in this bag was Shota, his passport, and his USA visa. So he's legally not allowed to enter the country. Thankfully, the two things that Hideki had on him was his passport and his bronze medal. So those two things, Hideki was okay, passport, bronze medal, but his caddy no longer has a visa and no longer has a passport, and they're getting on a plane the next morning to fly back to the States to play in this tournament. So this is a problem. So what happens is Hideki, he flies to Tennessee by himself. Shota cannot. He actually has to go from London, I think, all the way back to Japan to get all of this stuff figured out. So again, going from one side of the world across the world. And so he goes to Memphis by himself. And right now, at this point in time, Hideki has no caddy. He's got no assistant, no right-hand man. This is the same guy that's been with him the whole time. So he calls this random guy that he's known from his past. His name was Taiga Tabuchi. So they've got, obviously, the pretty sweet Japanese names. And so basically what happens is he calls this random stranger to come be his caddy for a week. So he replaces his original caddy, Shota, with Taiga. So Shota is replaced by Taiga, not Tiger Woods, Taiga Tabuchi. So he's got this new caddy on the bag. They're trying to figure out each other. They're trying to figure out how to work together. And just slowly but surely, they start to figure it out. He goes to Memphis, Tennessee to play in a tournament. And guess who wins the tournament? Hideki Matsuyama and his fill-in caddy, Taiga. They literally basically met each other on like Monday or Tuesday. And they ended up winning the tournament on Sunday because these two guys, they said, we're together. I'm for you. I'm going to be this fill-in, this substitute that I don't even know you. We're just going to make this work. We're going to go figure it out. In sports, there's a term for this. It's called next man up. Basically, the idea of next man up is that there's someone goes down, the main guy, the main character goes down, someone else has to step up in his place, in his shoes, and do something, fill in, and hopefully do a good job. And this guy, he did a good enough job where he got his boss for a week to win this tournament in Memphis. And basically, it was just kind of this obviously viral story that, again, Shota, he figured it out. He's now at the next tournament. He got his visa from Japan and everything like that. He's all good to go. But if this guy right here, Taiga, if he did not answer the call, which he was in Japan at this point, he flew from Japan to Tennessee to come be this guy's right-hand man, and ended up teaming up with him and ended up winning this tournament. If he didn't have the mentality of, I'll do whatever I need to do, I'll step up in whoever's place I need to step up in, and I am going to make this happen. We're starting this morning a series throughout the rest of the academic year through the book of Joshua. And what I want you to do when you think about the book of Joshua, I want you to picture this right here. I want you to picture this fill-in caddy, Taiga. He gets a call. He says, you're in charge now. You're in. Get in the game. And he was ready to go, and he did a good enough job to get his boss the trophy. Right now, we pick it up here in the story. I'd like you to turn to Joshua chapter 1 in a caddy switch, in an assistant switch, where God, the main character, God is the ultimate main character, of course. So in this illustration, God is the golfer, Hideki Matsuyama. But we have now a new assistant, a new guy in charge that has just stepped in. God calls him to lead these people, lead the people of Israel to success. And God does bring success through Joshua. But we're kind of in this period, Joshua chapter 1, of the changing of a guard from the greatest main character, I would argue the greatest main character of the whole Old Testament, Moses, one of, if he's in the top 2 or 3 that you would choose, where Moses is the guy. He is the main character. He is the man. And so now Moses dies, and the people of Israel, they're about to go into the land. He gets a new assistant, if you will, Joshua, to assistant and servant to God. And God is going to take his people through this next man up, through this substitute, through this new guy. And he's going to bring his people into the land. Jumping into any book of the Bible, you've got to first understand the context and kind of where we find ourselves. We've been in Ephesians, and then over the summer we talked about the disciples, and now we're in the book of Joshua. And I'm just going to tell you this, Joshua is so incredibly, completely different from anything that we've talked about so far. Very different. The way that we read these stories are going to be different. We're going to apply them differently. We're going to think about them differently than Ephesians. We're going to think about them completely differently than the disciples. Well, maybe not as differently, a little bit differently than the disciples. And so it's important for us this morning to focus ourselves into this new genre where Joshua, it is a history book. So think about history class. Think about a history book. It is a recording of what happens in history, going from one story to the next. And so some stories are good, some stories are bad. So that's where it's probably similar to the disciples. But I'd like you to look at Joshua chapter 1, verse 1. We're going to read the first 5 verses this morning. And then we're going to break down this book for the rest of the year as we study it. So Joshua chapter 1, verse 1, we've got this new guy, next man up, who's going to lead the people into the promised land. Joshua 1:1 says this. It says, "Now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, 'Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise and go over this Jordan River, for you and all of the people into the land that I am giving you to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you. For just as I promised to Moses, from the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all of the land of the Hittites, to the great sea toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory, and no man shall be able to stand before you all of the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will now be with you, Joshua.'" He says this, end of verse 5, "I will not leave you, nor will I forsake you." We pick it up here in the story of this changing of the guard from Moses to Joshua in a history class, recording historical events. And I don't know how you feel about your history class, if you're a history person or if you're a math person or if you're a science person. I will tell you this, history was not necessarily my favorite subject in school. But I want this to be your favorite subject in school, if you will. Where history, this history, if you are a Christian, if you have a relationship with God, this history is the most important history class that you're ever going to take. Because what we're going to learn in the book of Joshua is we're going to learn a couple things. We're going to learn who God is. We're going to learn how faithful God is. We're going to learn about how the people of Israel did not obey God the way that they should have and how you should obey God instead. We're going to learn a lot of things about the God that we just worshiped. And as we read the story of Joshua, as we read the book of Joshua, as even I read a couple of those verses right then and there, I want you to think about this story is about my God. This story, this God right here is the same God I just finished worshiping about 5 minutes ago. That makes this history class very important. Point number one, you can write it down this way. View this year's History of Israel class as important. View this year's History of Israel class as important. Joshua is a history of Israel, the good and the bad, and sometimes a little bit of the ugly as well. But it is going to teach us who God is. It is going to teach us how God cares for his people and how God also cares for you. If I told you God cares for you, you'd probably say, yeah, I believe that. But what does that actually look like? How does that affect your life? How does that affect your prayer life? How does it affect your obedience to God? Those are all questions that we're going to answer in this story or in this series throughout the year. I know some of you, when I said the book of Joshua, some of you had kind of a framework or an idea of what the book of Joshua is about. But I know others of you here in this room, I said book of Joshua, and you went to the table of contents, and you're like, I don't even know. What is this story? Where is it found? Like, what's going on? And I'll just say, just put your bookmark in Joshua because we're going to be here for the rest of the year. But what is Joshua about? Just to give you a brief, like very basic Old Testament survey type outline, this is kind of the flow of the book of Joshua. We're going to obviously break it down in more detail, but it kind of falls into four subsets, 4 sections of the book. You can write this down if you want to. You don't have to write it down. You can take a picture, whatever you want to do. But kind of this is how the outline goes in the book of Joshua. First of all, this is Israel. This is before they've gone into the promised land. And so the first 5 chapters are when Israel is about to go into the promised land. So there's stories about the spies going in and figuring out what's going on, talking about what we're going to do when we go over there. Chapters 5 to 12, so one half of 5 is the beginning, second half of 5 is 5 to 12 is when they're going and fighting battles. So you guys know the story of Jericho and the walls come tumbling down and other stories, other battles where God makes the sun stand still in the sky for it to be a longer than 24-hour day so that his people can fight. We're going to read stories like that. And then it gets really fun in chapters 13 to 21. If you even just thumb over there, it's a lot of random names and land and go to this place, to this river and that rock and then this valley. And it's a lot of like detailed geography going on. And so that we're actually going to fly through. I think I'm preaching like 5 chapters in one sermon or something like that. Like 6 chapters maybe in one sermon. It's a lot of stuff. We're going to cover a lot of ground. But then chapters 22 through 24 is after the people of Israel, they've settled into the land, them reminding themselves that when we are in this land, we need to remember God. We need to obey God. And so we're going to see a couple themes throughout this book about God's faithfulness to his people. We're going to see themes about obedience and disobedience. We're going to talk about faith. We're going to talk about works. We're going to talk about obedience to God. We're going to see times when Israel trusted God, times when Israel didn't trust God. We're going to read stories about the people of Israel going and killing men, women, and children. Like we're going to go through a lot. And it's all going to focus itself back into this, is God is faithful, and if God is faithful, you must obey him. People of Israel, they didn't obey God the way that they should have. Actually, spoiler alert, the book of Joshua, it goes relatively well. It doesn't go perfectly well. They don't do everything that they're supposed to do. In fact, they go into the land and they don't finish the job. Joshua 17, 12, and 13 describes that they left jobs unfinished. where they went into the land, they conquered some people, but they didn't conquer everyone, and God told them to conquer everyone, and so basically there's some consequences. Basically, the book of Joshua is similar to what happens when your parents tell you to go take the trash out. I don't know how you are when it's like, hey, go take the trash out. Some of you guys, you take the trash out and you just take the actual bag and you just throw it outside into the can, the big garbage can out there. And then there's that really fun part of taking the trash out to put the bag back in. I hate putting the bag back in. I'm going to be honest, I'm bad at that. The book of Joshua is basically the people of Israel taking the trash out but not putting the bag back in. They don't finish it up. They're not completing the obedience. And so we're going to learn about that. Going to even relate that to your relationship with your parents. We'll talk about all of those things. But again, to those of you that maybe don't exactly know what's going on here in this story, I just want to kind of give a brief overview, a brief summary, Old Testament survey of everything that has taken place before. So subpoint A, this is not even really a subpoint, it's more of a question, is how did Israel get to this point that we are here in this story? So this is the longest subpoint of my life, Genesis 12 to Exodus 34. That's a pretty long subpoint. Let's read it. Open up to, no, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Just to give you a summary of everything that took place. How did Israel get here? Maybe you know somewhat of the story of the Old Testament. Maybe you know people of Israel. They've got some land. What's taking place? Genesis 12, you write that down because Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3 are three of maybe the most important verses in the Old Testament actually. Where God, he makes this promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, where he says this to Abraham. Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. The Lord, he makes a promise to Abraham, and he tells Abraham, he says, go from your country and your kindred, your family, and your father's house to a new land that I will show you. And he makes three promises here. First about land, and then he says, verse 2, he says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. He's talking about you're going to have lots of kids. You're going to have descendants like the stars in the sky, like the sand on the seashore. And he also promises that they will be a blessing. In verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. If you know anything about the story of Abraham, God makes this promise here of these three things. That he's going to give Abraham land, he's going to give Abraham people, descendants, make him a great nation, and then also he's going to bless the nation of Israel. And so really the summary of Genesis chapter 12 to Exodus 34 is they kind of go back and forth between this land. If you see there on the right side of your worksheets, you've got a chart, and you know how much I love charts, right? And so because I love you, I made a new chart for you to give you a little Old Testament survey, okay? You don't have to go to seminary to learn about the Old Testament. So here, I did a little survey for you. Starting off just thinking visually like a map. We'll throw the next slide on the screen. We have this story in Genesis chapter 12 where Abraham, or first of all, I guess first slide is that Israel. If you don't know where Israel is, that's where it is. So yeah, cool. Next, Abraham leaves his city called Ur, which is kind of over in that peninsula area. It's kind of like Iran, Iraq area, modern day Iran, Iraq. And he's told to go up these two rivers to come down to the promised land. So what Abraham does in Genesis chapter 12, he takes his family. God says, go to this new land that I'm going to give you, and he goes to this land. And then there in the land, there are four guys that live there. Next slide, we've got Abraham, we've got Isaac, we've got Jacob, and we've got Joseph. So if you have your charts there, you can write those three guys down, four guys down, where these are the first four guys into the promised land. The book of Genesis covers this story. Abraham goes to the land. His son Isaac stays in the land. And then his son Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, 12 tribes of Israel. And you know the story of Joseph. Joseph, the guy with the coat of many colors, he gets, or finish writing the chart down. I'll get to the end of the story, I guess, in a second. But Joseph, he's an important son of Jacob. His brothers don't like him. They throw him in a pit. Then they sell him to Egypt. And then next slide, we have Joseph then leaving the promised land to go then down to Egypt. And at the end of his life, Jacob also goes as well. So we've got Joseph and we've got Jacob that go down to Egypt, and they go and they live there. 10 plagues, you've got Pharaoh, let my people go, all of that whole thing. Moses shows up on the scene, and what Moses does is he then takes the people from there out to the wilderness. But before then, you can write down on the Egypt side, you've got Jacob is there, you've got Joseph, you've got Moses, and then Joshua is born there, and then he leaves quickly because he goes into the wilderness. But Genesis and Exodus describes the time of which people of Israel are in Egypt. Joseph goes down there at the end of his life. Jacob comes as well. You can read that story from the end of Genesis. Genesis about 35 to 50 is a story of Joseph and Jacob and their time going down to Egypt. And also on this chart, just to clarify here, Joseph is not Moses' dad, okay? So the rest of them, they're kind of related. Joseph is not Moses' dad, and Moses is not Joshua's dad. So just to clarify that. But then from Egypt, the people of Israel, they leave Egypt and they go out into the wilderness. So Moses and Joshua, they lead the people across the Red Sea. And so you've got the famous story in Exodus 14, where the people of Israel, they cross the Red Sea in a miraculous way. God parts the waters. He brings his people, and then he has them wander around in the wilderness, in kind of the Saudi Arabian wilderness there for a bunch of years. And a bunch of people die. The older generation, they die. So then Moses, he leads all of the people all the way literally to the border, to the river that separates the wilderness from the promised land. But right here, Moses dies. And so we have in the wilderness, one step ahead. Yeah, wilderness, Moses and Joshua. Moses and Joshua. Super fun chart. I made this chart. I looked in all of my Old Testament survey books, could not find this chart. So I was like, here you go. It's a fresh chart. Cool. No one cares. I thought it was cool. So wilderness, Exodus talks about it. Numbers talks about it. Deuteronomy talks about it. I have Leviticus on there too. Leviticus is not a history book, but it's kind of in that time period in the wilderness. But then we have Moses dying on the banks of the Jordan, right before the Jordan River, right before the Promised Land. And then Joshua, his job in this successive history is to take the people of Israel across the Jordan to finally take back the Promised Land. So that's the last box there of your chart. Is Joshua is the guy that takes the people of Israel into Promised Land Part 2, the time that they get back to where they're supposed to be. God has been faithful all the way from Abraham to say, I'm going to give you a land. And then they left for a little while, and now they make their way back. So God is his promise. You don't need to turn there. When you're done writing Joshua's name down, you can write Deuteronomy 34. You don't really need to turn there because it's actually on the other side of the page. But Deuteronomy 34 verses 4 to 9 describes this passing of the baton from Moses to Joshua. Or Moses, he was the guy. He was the goat of the prophets, of the people that had led the people of Israel. But now we've got the new guy. And he says, all of these promises, Moses says, all of these promises are going to now be applied to you, Joshua. So you're going to get to go in. You're going to get to go be with the people. So subpoint B, the next question is, who is Joshua? Who is this guy, Joshua? Again, not really a subpoint, but we have here in Joshua 1:1, we have the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, and it says Joshua, son of Nun, is Moses' assistant. And now he's the next guy in charge. Next man up. God is not done with his promise. He promised Abraham, I'll give you land. A lot of stuff has taken place. And to Joshua, he says, we're going to finish that job. We're going to get you there. We're going to let you move in to the promised land. So who is Joshua? Joshua's got a very significant name. Very significant Hebrew name where it's literally two words put together. It's the word Yahweh, the word Lord, and the word saves. And so Joshua's name is a really important word because it's literally God communicating through his servant Joshua that he is going to save his people. Yehoshua is the Hebrew, or Yeshua for his nickname. It's kind of the shortened way to say it. Translated into English is Joshua. If you know anything about this word, when the Yehoshua, when you translate it from Hebrew, the original language of the Old Testament, into Greek, it's actually Jesus, which is the name for Jesus. So Jesus, I don't know if you've realized this, he's actually the Greek form of the name Joshua, which communicates that God saves, Yahweh saves, the Lord saves. And so first of all, just before we even jump into who this guy was, his name was significant because God was going to do something spectacular by saving his people through this guy named Joshua. Give you a brief summary of who this guy is. You can write down Exodus 17, this story of when they were fighting this battle. Moses, he was the commander. He was really the spiritual leader. And Joshua was the commander. You guys know this famous story of Moses when it says that God was going to give them success if two people would hold up his arms like this. Well, Moses was up on this mountaintop. God was giving them military deliverance and victory over these people. And Joshua was actually the commander. So we've got Moses up top. We've got Joshua down below fighting these battles. And he turns into this trusted assistant, this trusted disciple of Moses, Exodus 33:11. It says, when the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face in the tent of meeting, as a man speaks with a friend, God had a close relationship with Moses. It says, when Moses turned again into his camp, his assistant Joshua, son of Nun, the young man, he would not depart from his tent. Joshua was constantly in the tent of meeting, constantly in the makeshift temple where God was. He was a very godly young man. He was also one of the men that were one of the 12 spies. If you know the story of the 12 spies, this is Numbers 13, where Moses sends 12 people into the land to go spy out the land. Again, not going to talk about that necessarily in much detail, but Joshua is one of those guys. So we've seen Joshua play a role in Moses' life. And then in Numbers 27, verses 22 and 30 and 23, this is where basically Joshua gets commissioned by Moses, where Moses puts his hand on him and says, you are going to be the next guy. Numbers 27, 22, and 23, it says, Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua, made him stand before Eleazar, the priest, and the whole congregation. He laid hands on him, and he commissioned him as the Lord directed through Moses. Earlier in the passage, it says, Moses says, I'm going to give you my authority. You're going to be the next guy in charge. That's Numbers 27, 22, and 23. So Moses, he doesn't go into the land. But then now look back at the text. God says here to Joshua, Moses' assistant, he says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore, Joshua, arise and go over this Jordan River, you and all the people, into the land that I'm giving to them, the people of Israel. So what God does here is he says, Joshua, you are going to bring the people into the land. So the last subpoint of why this is important, subpoint C, write down this way, why is Israel's land important? Why is Israel's land important? I don't know about you. Actually, I do know about you because I can see you. And I see a lot of you guys starting to fall asleep a little bit right now. You're like, oh. And every eye just went up. It popped up. No, not me. So, yeah, we got some of that tiredness. It's hot in here. I get it. And so you're sitting here, and maybe you're starting to get bored. And you're like, this Old Testament survey thing, what does this matter to me? Israel getting land, like literally, why does that matter? What does that matter to me? I'm about to go to school tomorrow. Like, that's what's on my plate. Like, why does this history matter to me? Well, Israel's land is actually extremely important. So the first time ever, I've got subpoints on a subpoint. Okay? So subpoint C-1. Why is Israel's land important? First of all, because of this. Because God promised land. Do you see what I did there? Promised land. You see that? That's pretty good. Promised land. It's a verb. Land is a noun. Yeah, so stop. Please stop. Promised land. Okay, why does it matter that God promised land? I want you to think about it this way. If God did not give the people of Israel land, God is not a trustworthy God. He is not worthy of your trust in him if he does not give them this land. That was a pretty bold statement I just made there. If God does not fulfill his promises, why in the world should you trust him? Have you ever had someone let you down before? When someone lets you down, they break your trust. It's really hard to build up that trust again, right? God is perfectly trustworthy. If God did not give the people of Israel this land, he would not be trustworthy. Therefore, when you bow your head tomorrow morning before you go to school and you pray, how do you know he's going to hear you? Does he even care? I don't know. Is he worthy of me putting my faith into him? To become a real Christian, I got to put my faith in what Jesus did. How do I know if God is legit? Well, he promised land, and then in Joshua, he gives them land, which proves that God is a trustworthy God. He would be unfaithful if he didn't do it. But if you notice here in verse 2, it says this. It says, I'm going to give you this land. Do you see what it says? It says, into the land that I am giving you. So this is God saying, I'm going to do this. But he also says at the beginning of the verse, he says, you go into the Jordan. What God says here is, trust me, I'm going to take care of you, but also there's an action involved. You must go do something about it. Where God empowers this land to become theirs, but they have to go out and obey God. That's why in Joshua, we're going to see this relationship between obedience and faith. Obedience and faith. If you're a real Christian, you've put your faith in Jesus, which means you also have to obey him. And we're going to see that play out in the book of Joshua. But we see here in verse 2 that God says, I'm going to do this, trust me, but you also have to go obey me as well. God is empowering the conquest, empowering the success, but also requires Israel's obedience. Kind of like at Christmas time, you set up a Christmas tree, and there's the star, and there's always like a big deal with who puts the star up, right? So, of course, because we're in this phase with our boys, it's like, Karina's like, Levi, put the star up. You put the star up. And so this is Levi. Do you see? This is Levi putting the star up on the tree. How is Levi able to put a star up on a tree? Is he doing it? Technically. But is he really doing it? No. Why? Because dad is empowering him to do the obedience. But then also mom's telling Levi, hey Levi, obey me, put the star up on the tree and let me get a picture. So there's a command to go obey, but then there's also an empowering by the father, in this case, to go complete that obedience. And so we're going to see in this book, we're going to see God say, hey, go into the land. But he's also going to say, I'm a God that's going to keep my promises as well, so you can trust me. Second thing we learn about and why Israel's land is important is because this proves that God loves to care for his people. Do you want God to care for you? I hope that you would answer that question. Yes, I do want God to care for you. That I want God to care for me. The book of Joshua is about God caring for his people. If you are one of God's people, God cares for you. That's a big deal. That's pretty significant. That's awesome. That's exciting. But God is the one that is choosing to love you and choosing to take care of you. You can write down Deuteronomy 7, 7, and 8. Deuteronomy 7, 7, and 8. Basically, this is what it says. Deuteronomy 7, 7, and 8. It says, God says, I chose you, Israel. I chose to set my love on you, not because of who you are or how special you are, but I am going to make you special by putting my love on you. Not because you earned it. If you are a child of God, you did not earn to be a child of God. You did not get it by your works. God made you his child by grace through faith. And now it says he cares for you. Now he loves you, and he's never going to leave you. We see that play out in our text as well. The last thing, the last subpoint on the subpoint is this. God had a plan for the land. We could get into that. We'll get more into that later on in this story. But God had a plan for the land then. He also has a plan for the land in the future as well, where he's got a plan for the people of Israel to reconvene in that physical land one day. Again, there's a lot on that, but we can save that for another day. That's why it matters. Back to verse 3. This is what God tells Joshua. Verse 3. He says this to Joshua. He says, every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given it to you already. Just as I promised to Moses, from the wilderness and this Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. I'm going to give you this territory. And he says here, I promised it to Moses, I'm promising it to you now as well. Point number 2, right on this way, you need to remember that God's promises never fail. Point number 2, God's promises never fail. Remember that God's promises never fail. Picturing this next man up thing, where the main guy, the main character, Moses, is gone. Is God just going to forget about us now? It says here, God says, no, I'm not going to forget about you. I remember you. I love you. I'm going to take care of you. I am going to let that promise continue. Notice just the language of verse 3. He says, every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, I've already given it to you. How descriptive that is. Everywhere you walk, it's yours. That right there, that's yours. That right there, that one's yours too. That one over here, that's yours too. That's your land. I had this great experience every Christmas time. My grandma, she would take me to Toys R Us. If you have never been to Toys R Us, then I'm sorry. But Toys R Us was awesome, man. I loved that place back in the day, where it was like the greatest thing in the world. It was around Christmas. It was like November time. My grandma, she would take me and my brother, and she's like, we're going to Toys R Us. Pick out whatever you want. And it was like, okay, throw that in the shopping cart, throw that in the shopping cart. And eventually she would be like, okay, enough is enough. Like, we're going to be done. But I would get to pick out my presents for Christmas. Do you know how much power I felt when I walked into the door of Toys R Us? It was like, yeah, I own this place because my grandma's going to pay for it right now. It was awesome. And granted, I get to pick 2 or 3 toys, whatever. That was all fun and cool and everything like that. The people of Israel right now, they are in the parking lot of Toys R Us. And they're looking into this land that looks pretty good. And they're going, wait, every single place that I step foot on is mine already? I want you to envision where they've been. The wilderness. Where has Israel been? They've been wandering around this right here. The wilderness. Does that look super fun? Hey, have you been to Havasu before? Yeah. California desert. Is that beautiful? No, it's not. Especially when you're stuck in it for hours and hours and hours. Looks like Ludlow, right? It's not great. It's not fun. But then they're looking over the river at what? This lush, beautiful farmland. Beautiful springs, waterfalls. And they're looking into this land, and God says, everywhere that you step, it's yours. Welcome to Toys R Us. It's yours. I want you just to, for a moment, I know you're not an Israelite right now, but just envision what it must have been like to hear this after you've been wandering around the wilderness, that this is now your land. And he says this, just as I promised to Moses, I'm going to give it to you. I'm not going to forget. And picture the hopelessness of, wow, our leader, our main leader has died. Man, what's going to happen to us? What's going to happen to us? God says, I ain't going anywhere. We're going to finish this job. I'm going to finish this job. Just trust in me and obey me. And we're going to make this happen. This promise goes far beyond Moses' death. God doesn't change because Moses dies. Numbers 23:19 says this. It says, God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said and will he not do it? Or has he spoken and will he not fulfill it? God promised to Moses, I'm going to do this. Moses dies. And now there's an opportunity to doubt. There's an opportunity to say, did God forget? This doesn't feel right. This feels a little too scary because our main guy, he's died. God, his promises hold fast. They don't go away. Verse 4, he lays out some geographical parameters of this land. And I know it's hard whenever we read verses like this. I do the same thing. The first time I read this verse in preparation for this sermon, you read it and you're like, okay, space over there and then space over there. And I've never been there, so I don't know. What did God promise here? Well, I just want to show you a map. Maps are helpful in Joshua. We're going to see a lot of maps. This is what God promises in the promised land. This is the parameters that he explains here. As far as the great river to the far north, to the great sea. But do you know what Joshua does? Well, I mean, we'll get to it by the time we get to the end of the story. That little red outline there is the only territory that Joshua actually conquers. That's a lot of green, and that's a really small little red sliver. God promises all of that. But when we finish the book of Joshua, we will see the people of Israel in that little red sliver. And I don't know about you, but you might ask yourself the question of, wait a minute, God, didn't you just promise that? You're pretty specific. Why is that not taking place? Now, number one, in one sense, because people of Israel, they did not finish the job like they were supposed to. But actually, crazy enough, God does give them all of this green when King David and then King Solomon become king over Israel, where they do get the entire portion there of the people of Israel. So God does hold true to his promises, but in the story of Joshua, we do not see it fully realized. There's going to be many opportunities during this study through Joshua. We're going to kind of be able to look at different promises of God. Specifically, God, what does he promise to Israel, but also what does he promise to me? Because when you read the book of Joshua, all of the promises that you see, you cannot, as a Bible student, you cannot apply every single one of them to you, because the people of Israel are different than you. You are not Israel. You are different than Israel. You are separate. And so we're going to have to do some interpretive work as we go through the book of Joshua to figure out which promises are for me and which promises are for Joshua and for the people of Israel. This promise here in verse 5 is one that is for Joshua, but we will see also is for us as well. Look at verse 5, Joshua 1:5. It says, "No man shall be able to stand before you all of the days of your life." What he's saying here is no one's going to stop you. No one's going to stop you. He says, "Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you, and I will not leave you or forsake you." God makes this specific promise that he's never going to leave Joshua. But we also see it later on in the Bible, we see it later on, just the principles of who God really is. That God has promised that same thing to you and me as well. Point number 3, you can write down this way. You need to be comforted that God will never leave you. Be comforted that God will never leave you. He will never forsake you. If you are a Christian, if you are one with Christ, that means that you are unified in a relationship with Jesus Christ. Can God ever leave his son? No. If you are a Christian, you have been given the Holy Spirit, the third member of the Trinity, to live inside of you. Can God ever turn his back on the Holy Spirit? No, he can't. This principle here of God having a permanent relationship with Joshua, that he will never leave him, that's for us too. More on that in a moment. Actually, you can just write this verse down. Ephesians 1:13 and 14. Ephesians 1:13 and 14. Basically, it says this. It says, if you're a Christian, he's given you his spirit that has, look at this, sealed you. The idea of sealing is this idea of you're a permanent sealing where you're connected, cemented with him. And it says, verse 14, who is the guarantee of our inheritance, which means that God's promise to you as a Christian, it will come to pass because the Spirit of God is living inside of you. More on that later. But back in verse 5, it says, no man shall stand before you. Or what God promises here to Joshua is that he's going to protect him. God, right now, he announces himself as the protector. He announces himself as the provider. And he says, if you trust me, I will provide for you. No one's going to stop you. I want you to think right now about God's promises never being stopped. That's a really incredible truth for you to latch your trust onto, that God, number one, does not change. And God, number one, is going to protect you, and he's not going to let you get destroyed. We know that New Testament Satan, again, we'll talk about that at another time. But a promise that is made to you that you know will come to pass, especially when you know it's good, is really important. If I told you right now, after the service, we're going to In-N-Out. If I said we're going to In-N-Out, honestly, that sounds so good right now. In-N-Out, specifically at the district, not the marketplace. Just to clarify, district, not marketplace, or Santa Ana, the one there, Caleb's one. But anyway, In-N-Out, if I said we're going to In-N-Out, and we get in the car, you get in my car that now works again, and we pass by a few different restaurants. We pass by McDonald's, and we drive past Burger King, maybe Wendy's, the square burgers, maybe Dairy Queen. What do you think? You want to go to In-N-Out? I do. Are any of those going to make you change your mind? Not me. Okay. So what God is saying here, I'm going to promise you some In-N-Out. We're going to make it there. No fast food restaurant is going to stand in our way. Don't quote that, but you know what I mean. Illustration here. Not even real tempting opposition will stop us. If we start driving and we see maybe some better places, maybe we see The Habit, if you're a Habit guy. We see Smash Burger. I like Smash. Maybe even Five Guys. Five Guys is pretty good, man. Or, the Shake Shack, people that like Shake Shack. I think it's good. It's good. It's good. But if I said we're going to In-N-Out, and in your mind you have the double-double, whole grilled onions, toasted bun, extra toasted bun, mustard fried with no pickles, if you have that in your mind with fries well done, you are thinking, I'm not stopping at The Habit. I'm not stopping at Smash. I'm not even stopping at Shake Shack. Because if I promise this, I'm going to make sure that it happens. Despite any opposition, any stumbling block, any speed bump in our way, we are focused on what's going to take place. What God does here is he promises one thing, and despite distraction, despite other options, he makes sure that it takes place. He makes sure that it happens. Isaiah 55:11 says this. It says, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return empty, and it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I have sent it. What God tells Joshua here, I promised this to Moses, I'm going to make it happen in your life too. That's encouraging. And you read right there at the end of verse 5, he says, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. Think about how comforting those words must have been to Joshua as he's looking out into a foreign land with lots of armies, lots of people, lots of scary circumstances, that God is never going to leave him. If you are a Christian today, God is never, ever, ever going to leave you. Jesus says no one can snatch you out of the Father's hand if you have a real relationship with him. God will be faithful to you for every single day, every single second of your life, even down to the small things. Are you discontent in your life right now? You've got things in your life that you're just like, man, I feel like God, he's not caring for me the way that I wish he would care for me. Or you're upset with certain scenarios in your life, certain situations. Or there's certain, people that scare you, or certain, relationships at school that scare you. This principle right here that God will never leave us and never forsake us, that actually shows up in the New Testament. You don't need to turn there. Write down Hebrews chapter 13. Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6. I'll read it quickly for you. Joshua chapter 1, verse 5 is quoted in the book of Hebrews, which we will see, side note, Joshua is very rarely ever quoted in the New Testament, which makes it kind of an interesting book. We don't find very many quotations, but when we do, I'll point it out. Like Hebrews 13, 5 and 6. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5 and 6, it's talking about money and contentment. And this is what it says. It applies the principle here with money. It says, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. It says, for he has said, referring to God, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Quoting Joshua chapter 1, verse 5. And it says this, so we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear, for what can man do to me? If you are a Christian, you do not need to fear other people. You do not need to fear man. You do not need to fear your circumstance. You do not need to fear that God will not take care of you because you're discontent in the situations situations of your life right now. Do you believe the promise that God will never leave you and never forsake you? Some of you in this room, honestly, you should not believe that promise because some of you in this room are not real Christians. This promise of God never leaving you, never forsaking you, that's actually not for you. But if those of you in this room that have repented of their sins and placed their faith in Jesus Christ, which is a free offer for every single person in this room, this promise stands fast. God will never leave you, never forsake you. In your worst day, in your biggest temptation, in the scariest moment, in the biggest trial of your life, God will never leave you and never forsake you, just like he never left Joshua. He did not forsake Joshua either. Seriously, I cannot wait to study this book with you. I think it's going to be helpful. I think it's going to allow us to see how great God is. It's going to allow us to see the promises of God and put our trust in him, and also see our need for obedience. So I'm excited to dig into this book throughout the rest of the year. But let's bow our heads and pray right now as we head out this morning. God, we do thank you so much for this promise here that to Joshua, you said that you would never leave him or forsake him, and you didn't. You fulfilled your promise, not in the exact way that maybe Joshua thought. We'll see why later on, but God, I'm so grateful this morning to be in a room that has people here that you have saved by the blood of your Son and have now promised that you will never leave them, you will never leave me, you will never forsake them, you'll never forsake me. And God, we thank you for that truth this morning. I pray for every student in this room to be encouraged with the fact that you are a God who is trustworthy. You are a God who is faithful. In trial and temptation, in whatever circumstance we're in our life right now, you have promised those in this room that are in Christ will never be left and never be forsaken. God, I thank you for that truth. I pray that we would live that truth out this week. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.